Good day and welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we look at what's really going on in the world of the BRICS. Now, my name's Rod McKenzie, and today I want to discuss how everywhere in the Western press there are the doommongers telling you that Russia's economic collapse is going to happen any day now. And if I had $5 for every article I read predicting its collapse over the last 3 years, I'd be very rich indeed. Now, the real situation in Russia is the economy, as it is balanced in the first quarter, has shown a slight deficit, but nothing to worry about compared with the calamities that are occurring in the economies of the countries of the G7 and the EU. Particularly places like Germany and Great Britain, whose are actually now serious economic basket cases. Now, according to the preliminary estimates of the Russian Ministry of Finance for the first quarter of 2025, the federal budget deficit amounted to 2.17 trillion rubles, which is about $19 billion at today's dollar exchange rate. Now, this figure represents a decrease of 1.88 trillion rubles compared to the same period last year in 2024. So what are the factors contributing to the deficit reduction, evolution of the budgetary policy, and what are the outlook for the remainder of the year? Well, according to the Russian Ministry of Finance preliminary estimates, the federal budget revenues for Q1 2025 reached 9.50 trillion rubles, and that marks a 3.8% increase compared to Q1 2024. Now, the Ministry of Finance has also reported that the volume of federal budget expenditures at the end of the reporting period did increase by 24% and amounted to 11.22 trillion rubles. Now, the Ministry explained that the current level of the budget deficit is mainly due to the advanced financing of expenditures in January 2025, which will not affect the implementation of the target parameters of the structured balance for the whole of 2025. Now, at the same time, in March of this year, the federal budget was actually in surplus according to the Ministry of Finance. Now, before I continue, I'd like to make an appeal. If you like and enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and my website, SCOBRICSinsight.com, to further develop it. You can do this by making a small donation, which can be done by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom of the video screen. Everybody who does donate gets a personal thank you from me, and I'm thanking you all now for watching. Do like and subscribe, and please keep the comments coming. Love to respond to them, love to read them, and I enjoy the fact that we're interacting. Now, analysts consider the slowdown in spending growth, which a lion's share have occurred at the beginning of the year, due to the accelerated advance payment of government spending in January-February, to actually be a positive factor. I mean, in March, the growth of expenditure slowed by 11% year on year to around 3.179 trillion rubles, and after extreme growth rates at the beginning of the year. And the budget for the month of March was ultimately in surplus, which had a positive impact on the final results of the first quarter when you look at it logically. And that's despite the fact that in January and February the federal budget of Russia was executed with a deficit of 3.8 billion, as pointed out by Verena Niktakova Olga, who's president of the analytical company Borsa. And she emphasised that Russia, unlike most other countries that you're probably aware of, does not rely on credit or large borrowing to fund its day-to-day operations. So the deficit stands at 1% of GDP, with the first month of spring seeing a surplus. Now, the total volume of tax revenues to the Russian budget continues to grow steadily, according to Andrei Loboda, who's an economist and director of communications at Bit River Investment Analysts. Now, the revenues from non-island gas sources to the Russian budget increased by 10.6% in the first quarter of 2025 compared to the same period last year, and amounted to 6.4 trillion rubles, which is actually quite a lot of money. It's about 70 billion rubles, dollars. The Ministry of Finance has clarified that figures slightly higher than the planned level, indicating a stable foundation for continued and accelerated growth in revenues. Now, the growth in non-oil and gas revenues is attributed to the increase in revenues from turnover taxes, including VAT, which in the first quarter amounted to 10% compared to the same previous year. Now, the level of inflation obviously contributes to the growth of such deduction, as does business activity, as well as the introduction of new fees and the increase in the rates of current ones. Now, specifically, the anticipated budget revenues from tax reform implemented last year and became effective on January the 1st of this year are estimated at 2.6 trillion rubles, which is about $30 billion, as outlined by Arthur Meinhardt, who's head of global markets at Foynville Investment Company. Now, it appears the manufacturing industry has been a significant contributor to the growth of the non-resource revenues, and that's been driven by an increase in production in the sectors of mechanical engineering, the chemicals industry, metallurgy, and also supported by import substitution and the state incentives into that type of thing. Now, it also appears that the agricultural sector is playing a major role, with an increase in exports of grain, meat and dairy products, along with a growth in domestic demand. People have more money in their pockets, so they're spending it more on food and other items. Now, the IT sector and services have also seen an expansion in digital services, telecommunications and IT exports, including software and outsourcing. The oil and gas budget for the first quarter were actually down by 9% to 2.64 trillion rubles. And that was mainly due to the one-time payment of an additional mineral extraction tax on oil back in February 2024 as a decrease in the average price of oil. Do you remember back then that was a windfall tax on oil because of the high prices that everybody was paying? Now, the budget for 2025 was prepared on the basis of an average export price of oil at $69 per barrel and a ruble to dollar exchange of 96.5. However, since the beginning of the year, there's been a significant strengthening of the Russian currency and a storm on the raw material markets against the backdrop of the tariff wars between the major geopolitical players and an increase in production by OPEC plus countries. Now, these developments are exerting pressure on the state's oil and gas revenues, which are contingent on these two parameters, according to Meinhardt. Now, that said, it's been acknowledged by the Ministry of Finance that there is a risk of reduction in oil and gas revenues due to the falling prices. And that's also a factor that they've taken into account. I mean, the tariff wars are making oil under a pressure from the slowing global demand, the EU and Asia's attempted transitions to renewable energy, and the rise in production in the US and OPEC plus countries. Of course, sanctions pressure continues in the form of restrictions or attempted restriction on the export of Russian energy resources, and certain logistical difficulties remain in terms of transportation to Asia. Now, if secondary sanctions from the US are introduced, they could also have a negative impact on the dynamics of oil and gas revenues. But I think that's more bluster from Trump than anything else. I mean, as the Russian finance ministry has highlighted, the budgetary rule in effect, it guarantees the stability of the budget system, regardless of the fluctuations in oil and gas revenues. I mean, in accordance with this rule, during periods of favourable price conditions, the additional oil and gas revenues above the $70 a barrel are transferred to the National Welfare Fund. And then during unfavourable periods, the NWF funds are used to cover the lost revenues when the prices drop. And currently, non-oil and gas revenues remain stable and are supporting the Russian budget. And it's also important to note that the financial safety cushion provided by the National Welfare Fund was established to mitigate potential shocks in the raw materials market. That was exactly what it was aimed for. And as of March the 1st, 2025, the liquid part of the fund stood at 3.4 trillion rubles, which is about $40 billion. Now, analysts have highlighted that the changes in budget policy have contributed to the reduction of the deficit, with the emphasis being on national projects in areas such as defence, technology, education and healthcare. In addition, the regions are being held to account through requirements for them to actually reduce the level of burden debts that they have and increase the efficiency of their spending, making sure that they get a serious bang for their ruble. In addition, private investment is being stimulated in the form of benefits for companies participating in the import substitution program, particularly in the export of non-resource raw materials and actually finished products. So the positive dynamics of the budget deficit have a restraining effect on inflation. A reduction in the deficit reduces the pressure on the money supply and also limits inflation. At present, expenses are 2.2% higher than the annual plan of 41.4 trillion rubles, while revenues are 8% lower than the plan at the moment. Now, analysts are monitoring the situation quite closely, and a negative scenario does remain a possibility. However, in the context of lower oil prices, increased government spending, and a stronger ruble, Russia's budget deficit could reach 3% of the GDP by the end of the year. However, that's not a huge amount if you take into what's happening in the US. At the same time, it's important that inflation doesn't increase in the context of the expected commencement of the key rate cycle in the second half of the year. Now, as Laboda emphasises, the total volume of tax revenues to the country's budget continues to actually grow when you've got low unemployment, high levels of employment, and a softening of monetary policy, a balanced market situation in the geopolitical economy. There's a high probability that Russia's budget is going to become a surplus again. So anyway, there's where it is. Russia, despite what the media predicts every week, is still financially in good shape, and it's not going to collapse anytime soon. So I'm sorry, Joe Blogs. Your videos are full of complete bovine excrement. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please watch, like, subscribe, press the alert button, and you get informed when I post a new video. And if you want to help me out, click on the thanks button at the bottom of the screen if you want to make a donation. See you all again soon. Thank you.